Good afternoon. Yes, as he said, my name is Susanna Moberg. I am the current 2018-2019 Student Senate President here at Dickinson State University. And it is my honor, thank you. It is my honor to be here today to introduce to you your next speaker. Katherine Joslin is a professor of English and founding director of the university's Center for Humanities at Western Michigan University. She received her bachelor's degree in English from Oakland University and her master's and doctoral degrees in English and American literature, respectively, from Northwestern University. Her teaching interests include American fiction and nonfiction at the turn into the 20th century, material culture and social and political history, and women writers. She has been presented with many honorable awards, including the Excellence in Teaching Award from the Western Michigan University Alumni in 1997, and the Distinguished Faculty Scholar Award for her work as a professor of English at Western Michigan University in 2011. Dr. Joslin became a Fulbright Scholar, senior specialist, and traveled to Egypt in 2008 and was named Visiting U.S. Fellowship by the Eccles Center at the British Library in 2014. Along with many essays, reviews, chapters, and co-edited books, Dr. Joslin is the author of many books like Jane Addams, A Writer's Life, Edith Wharton and the Making of Fashion, and the co-authored book Theodore Roosevelt, A Literary Life. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Katherine Joslin.
Here we are, the last one. How are you all today? Good afternoon. We get to go straight from here to get drinks, as I understand it. Is that right, Clay? Okay, all right. I want to thank Susanna for that lovely introduction. I want to thank Clay for being Clay and for doing all those things that Clay does. I just don't know a person in my life quite like Clay. So thank you for this. Thank you for your work. North Dakota thanks you. Michigan thanks you. Okay, there's another person I'd like to, there's another man. I know this is Women in the Arena, and now I'm talking about another man already. So let's start, okay. I'm a second wave feminist. That's why I look a little old. Much of my work has been retrieval work. I've really been interested in the retrieval of women writers. I worked with Edith Wharton when nobody read her. I'm a founding member of the Wharton Society. I put together a conference on her in Paris and such, and now everybody reads her, so I'm happy about that. I decided to work on Jane Addams when nobody knew Jane Addams. I went to read her letters as I read Edith Wharton's letters. And now Jane Addams, who's, I'm going to talk about her in a minute, but she's known today as a writer and a philosopher. And I'm the person who wrote the book about her as a writer. Working with that model, as I sometimes say in these talks, I decided maybe I should do a boy. So I decided I would work on Theodore Roosevelt. And I had no idea what I had picked up. I mean, my goodness, as a reader and a writer, he's extraordinary. There's hardly any person in the history of mankind that has that kind of literary range and experience. So when I found out the kind of trouble I was in, I called downstairs to my husband, Tom, who was probably cooking dinner, and I asked him if he would join me in this project. And so he can't talk today because this is Women in the Arena. So I'm really sorry, Tom, you can't talk today. So I'd like you to thank Tom Bailey for helping me. Yeah. Okay, so we're literature professors. We're kind of strange people. We're not historians, and so some of the stuff that we've heard from these other points of view have been really instructive to us, even though we've just worked on this literary biography. So I'm going to talk today about books that Roosevelt read. And I know that he's read them because I read about them in his diaries and his letters and his papers. It's an eclectic group of women writers, but that's what I'm going to focus on for the next 40 minutes or so. The Dakota rancher, the leader of the Rough Riders, the thoroughly manly boxer, and the big game hunter enjoyed curling up with books, many of them written by women. Among his the first novels that the Roosevelt children enjoyed were A Summer in Leslie Galway's Life. How many people have read that book? And another one, An Old-Fashioned Girl. The tales were written for girls to usher them into conventional lives, and as it turns out, they delighted the boys too. Theodore and his siblings, Anna, Elliot, and Corinne, subscribed to Our Young Folks, an illustrated magazine for boys and girls, which introduced them to writers who would become favorites, including Louisa May Alcott and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Bundles of books went everywhere with the Roosevelt children. I suppose we've read about 50 since we left America, 11-year-old Theodore reported in a diary after 4 weeks in Europe. Throughout his life, he never spent a day without a book in his hand or in close reach, picking it up as respite from play or as reprieve from boredom or duty. He read anything he could get his hands on, newspapers, magazines, novels, and books of all sorts. And so we're going to be talking about some of those books today. Let's see. All right. I'm calling this the Kidskin Library only because I'd gotten charmed by the metaphor of the kidskin. So if it starts sounding ridiculous, raise your hand. Okay, so what we always know about Roosevelt is how much he favored men and men's writing, the Maine Reed crowd and such. We know that when he went to Africa, his sister bound his favorite books, things from Homer through Thackeray to Mark Twain, in pigskin so that he could take it to Africa. How many people know about the Pigskin Library? You probably all, oh, good. There are people in here who don't know, so I might tell you anything. Pigskin, how many people know about pigskin leather? It's used around what? What do you know? Football, that's right. It's a hardy leather, isn't it? How many people have played football? I broke a wrist catching a football once, and the doctor said to me, "Did you catch the ball?" And I said, "Of course I did, or I wouldn't be here." Anyway, the pigskin, okay, so what was good about the pigskin leather was that it was thick and hardy and resistant to sweat and blood. However, and I want to say one more thing. So Theodore Roosevelt argued loudly, by the way, that no single collection of books were a guarantee of anything, certainly not education. He argued with Harvard's President Eliot about the 5-foot library. He thought that was a silly and not productive way of talking about reading at all. One chooses a book to fit a mood and gathers others around it that come to mind. So here is what we have this afternoon, an assemblage of books that all of you, by the way, can read if you want to follow this up by going home, because they're all available online. What if Roosevelt had clad books by favorite female writers in kidskin? Where are we? There we are again. Okay. So kidskin, how many people have had kidskin before? Do you have kidskin gloves? Ooh, okay. Okay, so what if TR had clad books by favorite female writers in kidskin? Kidskin is from the height of a baby goat. It's supple and elegant, but strong and resilient. Women, especially women of Roosevelt's class, wore kid gloves to protect their hands from the toxicity of the city, its filth and contagion. Remember that his mama died of typhus. The gloves stretched over the hand and up the arm with buttons that allowed a woman to pull her hand out if she needed it to eat. And then she'd put it back in the glove for the protection in the inside and the outside world. And remember that men wore kidskin gloves in the evenings. And note too, if you will, whenever possible, I'm going to try to pick pictures of these women with kidskin gloves on. That's not been easy to do. But anyway, I'm following on with the metaphor. Louisa May Alcott is one of the first readers that would go in the Pigskin Library. You know that the Alcotts lived among the Emersons and the Thoreaus and Hawthorne and even Longfellow. She worked as a nurse during the Civil War. Her novels for children made lots of money. What people may not know so much about her is that she also published as A.M. Bernard novels for grown-ups. They were about spies and revenge and cross-dressing. We're back to that. Note her transgender line. She once wrote, "I am more than half persuaded that I am a man's soul put by some freak of nature into a woman's body." The children read An Old-Fashioned Girl. That was one of the earliest books that were supposed to teach them how to become good girls and good women. Another favorite of the Roosevelt children was Harriet Beecher Stowe. She had a traditional man-styled education, by the way. She witnessed race riots in the 1836 and 41, and she became, as we know, an ardent abolitionist. Her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was the bestseller of the 19th century. She said at once, "I hope every woman who can write will not be silent." The books that Roosevelt wrote about in his journal was called Little Pussy Willow. Little Pussy Willow goes out in the world, and she's just the best darn character you could come up with. And she does well over and over and over again. She learns how not to think about herself, but to think about others. And she says at the beginning of the book, "I hope you will grow up to be nice, good girls, seeing the bright side of everything." There's a lot of Roosevelt in that when you think about how he talked about his life. Always the best life, the best father, the best wife, the best of everything. Another favorite of his was Adeline, Dutton, Train, Whitney. Has anybody ever heard of her? You can look her up too. She's interesting. She, along with Harriet Beecher Stowe, and this is going to become important, had children first and then wrote later. So she had her children. I don't know if she had the 4 or not, but she I should look that up. And then she wrote traditional popular stories for girls. And they're stories where home is the happiest place. And I had to choose her, and you're going to see why in just a minute. Can you read that? You hardly ever find your own name in literature, so I think that whenever you find it, you ought to use the example. So what happens in this book is that there's a girl named Leslie. This is a summer in Leslie Galewaith's life. Leslie Galewaith goes off for a summer. She's a wealthy kid. They're going to go to Saratoga Springs, and she's going to have a lot of fun for this summer. But she knows at home 2 girls, Susan and Martha Joslin. And the Joslin family is, and I know this all too well, doesn't have a whole lot of money. They're hardworking, and they're good people. The kids are seamstresses. And so Leslie thinks, won't it be a lark? I'll take these girls with me to Saratoga Springs. Well, what she learns when she gets there is that the Joslin kids seem to have better manners and better values. They're better girls than all those Saratoga Springs girls. And so Leslie finds out the sort of true meaning of life from the Joslins. And it happens, too, that Martha Joslin happens to meet a doctor while she's there, and then she gets to get married at the end. of the novel. But again, you can see a lot of Roosevelt's ideas that come up over and over again in the books that he selects or has selected for him to read. Another writer is Augusta Jane Evans. I want to say a couple of things about these writers. If we're talking about women in the arena, all these people were popular writers. They all made a lot of money as writers, and many of them made way more money than Theodore Roosevelt made as a writer. So he's in the arena in that way with them. Augusta Jane Evans is the first lady writer to earn $100,000. She was, and now think of the Bullock family and the mother's family in the South. She was a Confederate, a secessionist, an anti-suffragist, and her novels were wildly popular and made into plays and then films. The one that he references is St. Elmo. We'll get to that in a minute. So in St. Elmo is a story, and it's a story that has a kind of theme of popular romances. How many people in here have read romances? How many people read them all the time? Has anybody been to the Ripped Bodice bookstore? So I heard that woman talking on NPR the other day. Anyway, so apparently romances are very, very popular indeed. They came under sort of different code words. Romances, they were also cheap fiction, dime novels, the kinds of things that Roosevelt's mama had told him not to read. Whatever you do, don't read those novels. So, of course, he read every one he could find pretty much all his life. But in St. Elmo, this one that's so popular, St. Elmo is actually a portrait of the young woman as an artist, a young writer as an artist. Her name is Edna, and she goes to live with a wealthy family, where she finds the boy of the family, the man, is St. Elmo. But he is rakish and mean and evil and coarse. And so there's this give and take between the two of them. He pursues her and she flees, and he pursues and she flees. By the end of the novel, if you know how romances turn out, how do they turn out at the end? What? They get married. Good idea. So, how is she going to marry St. Elmo, you might ask? Well, St. Elmo, as it turns out, becomes a minister by the end of the novel, and thus they're able to marry. And it sold 1 million copies in 4 months. It was tremendously popular. Romances, these kinds of, and I was trying to think about why Roosevelt would choose a romance. How could that add to his life? Well, there are two things you get from a romance novel. One, there are two comforts. One is you get an expression of emotion. And lots of people talk about how it was hard for Roosevelt to express emotion. He does sometimes in his diaries. He certainly cries at times in his life. But he doesn't carry a lot of emotion on the outside. But reading these romances allowed him, of course, the expression of emotion through a tale. And the other comfort of a romance is that it's a guaranteed formula, and you have the surety of a happy ending, so that the ending in marriage is what one would expect. So there are romances that tickled, did I say tickled? Theodore Roosevelt. Another writer, I know, I wanted to say in this one, this is a theme of the book, and you think about Roosevelt as we've been talking about him. Women have the right to be learned, wise, noble, useful, to advise, to plead, but not the right to vote. And that's these were ideas that he was, that were coming up, welling up in Roosevelt as he was doing this young reading. So there are a couple more, I'm going to do a couple more romances just to give you a sense of what he was looking at. There was another writer whose name was Rita. Her name was Maria Louisa May, who called herself Rita when she was a kid. And Rita, she was a really interesting figure, as you can see by the a cartoon there with the smoke rings and looks sort of vaguely like an opium den. She went to soirees in London with Oscar Wilde, with Swinburne, with Robert Browning. She wrote 40 lurid romances, and they were lurid but with social criticism, which may have been what interested Theodore Roosevelt. Her most popular novel was Under Two Flags, which tells the story of a disgraced aristocrat who can't figure out what else to do with his life. And he joins a French battalion in Algeria and goes off for many melodramatic and titillating adventures. He comes upon a young woman whose name is Cigarette, and there's an interesting sort of titillating play there. She eventually sacrifices herself for him, and because of that, what happens? He becomes a better man, and he goes home and leads the right kind of life. Another one of the, and this is, of course, what Roosevelt admits himself. I did read dime novels in greedy and fierce hope of coming on upon something unhealthy. He has a good sense of humor. How many people have read, do you read these things? Like, I'll tell you one thing that happened to me when I was 13 years old. My parents took me on a vacation. Have you ever been with your parents on a vacation when you're 13? The last person you want to see is one parent or the other. So when we got to this lake house, there was a stack, and I was about this tall then, and it was that tall. Think of the 5-foot library, I suppose, of true romance magazines. Have you ever read those? Oh, it's like candy. You just pick one up. And so I read them from the top of the stack to the bottom of the stack. And there are a couple things that I learned. One is that there's a definite formula, and the other is you might think you're getting sex, but you're not really getting sex, or a 13-year-old might be awfully confused about what you're getting. So what they do is they promise flirtation and the ripping of the bodice, but they produce in the end stories of what? Sort of that people who've retained, I guess, certainly their virginity, but retained their sense of sexual propriety. And that's the kind of novel that Theodore Roosevelt was interested in. As he said, I read a whole bunch of them, always hoping for something unhealthy. How many people have ever read a book hoping to find something unhealthy? If we just have some readers, the rest of you people need to get out there. How many of you have ever read one of those books and underlined the dirty parts? No, I'm an English teacher, so I do things like that. Then when you go back, you can just read the underlines, you see. So something like that was going on in Roosevelt. We've been talking about him as a sexual being and maybe a sexual being and how he's a sexual being. I think a lot of these ideas came from his early reading. Okay, another one is, and I'll just do a couple here. Octave Thanet. Now, she called herself Octave because the name didn't show gender, by the way. We've been talking about genders. What we know about Octave Thanet is she's actually Alice French. And she had a lifelong lesbian friendship, marriage, partnership with Jane Allen Crawford. And she wrote popular sentimental stories, just one after another. Again, wildly popular writer. I think in the story down the little Mississippi River, when he catches up with the thieves, I think they've got, I think they might have maybe both of these writers in their collection. How they got there, I don't know, if it's maybe Roosevelt was fictionalizing a little bit. Anyway, in the novel, A Man of the Hour, as Alice French wrote to Theodore Roosevelt, he often wrote to people he read. He'd stop reading in the middle of a book and write to them. He was interested in being part of a wider literary world in that way. And French wrote back to him, "I know it isn't art, but perhaps it's truth." In this particular novel, A kid named John Ivan, it sounds like they've chosen the same name twice. John Ivan Winslow has and this is important, a Russian mother who's a socialist who ruins the marriage. Her socialism ruins the marriage. They divorce, and the father remarries, and when he dies, he leaves his son only, everybody got this? Only $100,000. What would that be today? $10 million? Why only $10 million? Okay, so $100,000. And what he does in the novel is he goes off and he proceeds to waste that money. Of course he does. Do you know how he wastes it? Helping poor people. Because you can't really help poor people, and they didn't get better, and he lost his money. And so at the end of the novel, he comes home. He returns home to his stepmother, broken and needing support and protection. And guess what? This is because this is going to end well. The stepmother explains to him what? Can you imagine? That the daddy who wrote the will did it just to trap him, and actually the whole inheritance was supposed to be his. And so he becomes a better man, and at the end he marries. There's another set of books, so that's those. We could do romances all evening, and maybe you should go and look them up and read some of them. He wrote, there are probably other books. I said this was an assemblage. Other books he would put in the Kidskin library. He was interested, of course, in social and political writers. And so I'm going to mention a few of these as we move forward. So he was reading Everyman's Magazine, and Kimberly, I think somebody referenced this one earlier. Was it The Woman Who Toils? Wasn't this it? How did we come upon the same one? We're reading in Roosevelt, right? In Everyone's Magazine, and this is in 1903, Roosevelt read two articles that captured his attention. I'm going to talk about The Woman Who Toils second. The first article that he read was about modern girls who lived in Newport, summered in Saratoga Springs, and how they had what? How they were, what do I want to say? Free from certain conventions of life. That is to say, they were all Gibson girls. And there's probably nothing that Roosevelt so disliked as the Gibson girl. There she is. She's scantily clad, thin of waist, wasp-waisted. She has her hair up and kind of tendrils, flirtatious look on her face. Certainly she has every intention of having sex and no intention of getting pregnant. So the Gibson girl particularly drew his ire. And so he wrote a letter to the editor, and in that letter he talks about such girls, the modern girls in Newport. A woman with a heart so cold as to know no passion, and a brain so shallow and selfish as to dislike having children. And so he had his eye on that kind of figure as he moved forward, as we've just been hearing from Kimberly and Stacy. Okay. And I want to break into that article for a minute. I'm going to come back to it in a minute. There was one particular woman who interested Theodore Roosevelt, and he wanted people to go out and read her work. And she's Kathleen Norris. She married the brother of Frank Norris, that guy, the novelist. And the brother became a kind of agent for her. He was a sort of man behind her success as a writer. He was also a house husband. He did all the cooking and cleaning. I mean, where do you get one of those guys, right? Kathleen Norris wrote wildly popular novels that were made into films and radio. She had a radio series. She may have been the first one to have a radio series. And this is the particular book that Roosevelt wanted us all to read. He said, "I wish that people would use these and other such books as tracts, now and then, he wrote in his autobiography. So he wanted to teach young women not to be Gibson girls, but rather to embrace this idea that he had of motherhood. In the novel, in this novel, what happens? You can imagine what happens. The young woman decides she's going to leave her mother. Her mother is this housefrau with all these kids. She's got 7 kids. And she decides she's going to go off to the city, and she's going to have a kind of a pleasant life. She's going to learn about the city and the sophistications of the city, and she does. She learns a lot. And when she comes home to talk to her mother about the new life in the city and how she's not really interested in her mother's life, that life of the dutiful housewife. You know what the mother tells her, if you think about it? She's one of 7 children, right? She happens to be, her mother tells her, child number 3. Child number 3. And what the daughter has been arguing is that she would have no more than 2 children. And the mother tells her, well, you know, you could do that. I could have done that too. But if I had done that, you would cease to be. And then you get the weeping scene with the mother, and she begins to understand the wisdom of her mother and the necessity of having 7 children, or at least the 4 or the 5. So what Roosevelt thought that one ought to do is to take some of these Kidskin books and use them as social tracts. That's what he meant them to be. The other article in the Everyman's Magazine was called The Woman That Toils. And what you have in that particular article, what I want to point out here is that he's picking up a magazine and he's reading all the articles. And they're different one from another. They're very different one from another. So he's also reading in The Woman Who Toils. The Woman Who Toils is written by the Van Voorst sisters. They published under Bessie Van Voorst, but it was Bessie and Marie Van Voorst. And what they did was they were undercover journalists. They wrote a book like Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickel and Dimed, if you've ever read that. So they went to work, the sisters went to work in a pickle factory, a cotton mill, as muckrakers. That was Theodore Roosevelt's word for writers like this. He got that word, you know, from Pilgrim's Progress. And what he didn't like about writers, really made him angry, was writers who would talk about, would dredge up all the sort of dirt, all the things that were wrong with society, like the man with the muck rake. And they'd rake the muck, but they never looked up, as the character doesn't, to try to find an answer to it. Theodore Roosevelt wanted answers to problems. He wanted to turn these things into law and law into deeds. And so with the Van Voorst sisters, he was interested, I want to say something else. The actual story of Bessie Van Voorst, by the way, is that she lived in Paris, she did war work, she married an Italian count, and she adopted a war orphan, just one. But TR argues for the limits on and from this article, he went on, as he did, and we've been listening to various accounts of this, he went on to argue for limits on the workday for women, for freedom from labor for children. All of these, as we've been talking about, were meant to secure his eugenics goal of avoiding race suicide. So that as women, he even had ideas that women should sit on chairs if they worked. It's not a bad idea, especially if they did physical labor. He wanted it to be easier for women. And what he wrote to the Van Voorsts about in that article was that, yes, it was fine to find out these things, but that we had to do something to change the conditions for women so that they could go on to become mothers. Another set of people that he knows, I'm going to move closer and closer to Roosevelt now in the Pigskin Library. He knew Ida Tarbell, and he admired her expose on John D. Rockefeller. And TR called the industrialists of the late 19th century, as we know, malefactors of great wealth. Tarbell was a progressive, a muckraker, an investigative journalist, And TR worked to move Tarbell's ideas and other progressive ideas into legislation, the Clayton Act, the Hepburn Act of 1906, and he supported the Mann-Elkins Act in 1910 and the creation of the Federal Trade Commission in 1914. It's interesting to me, too, because I think there's a picture of Ida Tarbell, isn't it, around here someplace? Anyway, with Ida Tarbell and he became friends, and there's one wonderful photograph of the two of them going to the Colony Club in New York City. And this is after maybe it's 1914 or so. Do you know what the Colony Club was? The Colony Club was the exclusive club in New York City that was funded and membered only by women. And it's interesting that, Roosevelt could only get there by invitation. So Ida Tarbell invited him to the Colony Club so that he could explain to the wealthy women why they should vote for suffrage, why they should want suffrage. So he became, in that way, the more progressive. It's odd, I suppose, that rich women were skittish about suffrage. Maybe we can talk about that later. He says, he agrees with Ida Tarbell, by the way. He says, men whom I know socially follow a course of conduct which, in its essence, is as immoral as that of any boodle alderman. So they were on the same page. Another, I want you to notice she's got the kidskin gloves. This is Jane Addams, one of my favorite pictures of Jane Addams. Jane Addams had a 40-year, what they called a marriage, to marry Rosette Smith. She called herself, Addams called herself the grandmother of social settlements, and she talked about her work in Chicago as a model of civic housekeeping. All those things are in line, all those metaphors are in line with the things that we've been talking about. She wanted to argue that a woman's place was in Chicago and founded, as you know, Hull House with Ellen Gates Starr in 1889. She went on to become a writer, a philosopher, a progressive, and a pacifist. And as we've been talking about, she seconded the nomination of Theodore Roosevelt at the Bull Moose Convention. That's a telegram that he sends to her to get her finally to agree to full-throatedly support his presidential bid, the third-party bid in 1912. Did I put it into the telegram, the flat-footed statement, without qualifications, that I am for women's suffrage? We've been talking about what Virginia was talking about. What woman would we vote for to be president of the United States if women could have been president 100 years ago? So I thought about that last night. I think Jane Addams is the perfect idea. She was a public woman. She was the president of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. She was an international figure. The women as World War I was getting started, the women at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom went around to all the world leaders, sat with them, and tried to get them to negotiate a peace before the bloodbath that would follow. She was, before that time, the most respected, the most revered woman in America. I could imagine her being voted in as president. Her pacifism made lots of people angry, including Roosevelt. And so she spent a lot of time sacrificing herself for her pacifism, which of course we admire today, and she won the Nobel Peace Prize. Oh, let me go back for that. I think the book of hers that I'd put in the Kidskin Library is A New Conscience and an Ancient Evil. The big topic in the United States before the war broke out was the condition of women. There were all these women who had poured into the cities. We were worried about their immoral life and what was going to happen to them. And she wrote this book about what she called white slavery, or sexual slavery, and the sexual vulnerability of women. I think that's one that Roosevelt, they don't have a letter of his or anything. I think this is the one he might have selected of hers. She wrote another lovely book called The Long Road of Women's Memory, but that was during the war when she was out of favor, and he certainly wouldn't have selected her then. There's another woman who's a big figure in Theodore Roosevelt's life, and her name is Augusta, and she's called Lady Gregory. Lady Gregory, how many people know who she is? She pretty much sort of single-handedly, although she worked with lots of people like Yeats and Synge and others. She revived the Irish language, folklore, the mythic foundations of Ireland. She helped to build the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. She was married, and she had one son. And that one son died also as a pilot in World War I. And Yeats wrote the poem, "An Irish Airman Foresees His Death." If you don't have anything else to do tonight, look up that poem and read it. It's profound and a little disturbing. I want to tell you one story about Theodore Roosevelt and Lady Gregory. He's especially keen, as we've been talking about, he loved the idea of Norse mythology, Celtic mythology, the idea of these grand mythic wars. And he often thought of himself, I think, as being caught up in it as part of it. But it's especially Queen Maeve that he loves. She would have thought a great victory and a great triumph for you to have fallen by her hand. And so Roosevelt reads these things, he gobbles them up. There's one story about Lady Gregory that I think is interesting. I'm going to tell you one more thing about her. She said once her husband died, she found the detachment of mind and the leisure for observation. And so the women that I'm talking about, and Lady Gregory is one, are not conventional women at all. Even as Roosevelt made this argument for how women ought to behave and protect and take care and have babies, his friends were actually women, often of another sort entirely. And Lady Gregory is one of these figures. In 1911, she brought John Synge's play, Playboy of the Western World, to New York. When the play had opened at the Abbey Theatre, there were riots all over Dublin. And when they came to New York in 1911, and the show went on the first night, people threw tomatoes and stink bombs, and there was a whole dust-up on the first night. The reason the play made people that so angered people, audiences, is that the Playboy of the Western World becomes a hero because he brags that he's killed his father. It goes on that maybe that didn't really happen. Oh, and there's a woman who has a slip-on and she's scantily clad. So those two things brought riots in Dublin and in New York. But on the second night in New York, and this is what you have to love about Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt accompanied Lady Gregory to the play for the second performance of Synge's Playboy of the Western World. And he brought also the police chief, McAdoo. And when they got to the scenes and the people started to, they were chanting and tapping their feet and started to get out the fruit and such, the folks were arrested. And so, because of Theodore Roosevelt, Irish theater was saved in New York, at least on one evening. I want to say something else about Lady Gregory, because these relationships with women, with literary women, were important to how he was developing his literary ideas. Not just that he liked Celtic folklore, or that he thought people ought to behave well at the theater in New York. But one of the things that Roosevelt was trying to do all his life was to construct a national literature. He thought that if America as a nation, this is the move into the 20th century, if we were going to be a real country, we ought to have a real literature, and that it should be American literature. And so he argues that the test for American literature is that it must smack of our soil. If we continue to read only British literature, it only means that the Brits could write. If we admire Irish literature, well, yeah, we may have forebears from Ireland, but that's not the same. He wanted, and Lady Gregory was his hero in this, he wanted to develop and construct a national literature. And he worked very hard on that project. There are a couple of other people I'm going to talk about. I've got like 3 left. One is a woman named Edith Franklin Wyatt. In his autobiography, when Roosevelt's trying to remember this long list of people he's read, and he has trouble, there's confusion for him in remembering the names of the lady novelists. He said, I wish I could remember more women writers. But one writer that he singles out is Edith Franklin Wyatt. And her book is Every One His Own Way. He got the title wrong, actually. But what I wanted to point out about Edith Franklin Wyatt is are there some students in here? Is there anybody looking for a research project? This is a woman who's not been done. I think she could be done. I think she should be done. So I'd like to convince somebody in the audience to do that. Her papers are in the Newberry Library. I couldn't find a picture online. So she's ripe for the picking. She wrote fiction and nonfiction and poetry. She helped to found Poetry magazine, and she worked with Harriet Monroe. Also, she worked at Hull House. She was a progressive activist, and she's the only female writer, as I say, who came to mind when TR was talking about the great influences of writers on him. I have much proof. And then he makes this comment that I think is important for my next character. He says, Roosevelt said, I have much profited by reading good novels. I have much profited by reading good novels and stories as by reading anything else. So when he picked up a novel and he read it, he meant for it to have its full effect on him. The novelist that he most admired, we've been talking about her, is Edith Wharton. Here's Edith Wharton in a rare photograph of her smiling. She's got those wonderful furs on. She puts those in her will, by the way. Those are family furs. And I'm sure she's got pigskin gloves on under there. But there, we've been talking about what Edith Wharton did as Virginia, of course, has given her a kind of portrait of her, that she was a woman who wrote, Theodore Roosevelt wrote 42 books and 6 others with other people, so we get the number 48, Tom and I do. Edith Wharton wrote 48 books in all sorts of genres, on household decoration, Italian history, novels, short stories. She was wonderful with plays. A lot of them didn't get produced, but they could be produced now. In the 1890s, she wrote Bunner Sisters, which is just a startling and stark portrait of women trying to make a living in New York City. When a man comes along in that story, by the way, and one of the sisters marries him, both sisters fail. The marriage doesn't work. The other sister is homeless by the end. It was a bold book. It was a bold novella to write in the 1890s, and Edith Wharton couldn't get it published, I'm sorry to say. But she published it later. Anyway, I wanted to talk for a minute about, well, I know we've done this a little bit, but I think it's useful to probably go back over it again. This is Teedy, calls himself Teedy, and Pussy Jones, that's Edith Wharton. I just want you to notice how similar they are. We've been talking about males and females and chances and no chances. They both have that sort of very intelligent, wide eyes, a kind of pensive brow. They look determined. They're terribly bright. They read and write right from the beginning. And they come up in old New York, where what are the chances for them to flower fully? The other thing about them, which you probably know, but maybe you don't, they both had asthma. They both found the kind of constrictions of their family life disquieting. As they got farther away from those families and exercised in the wider world, for both of them, the asthma subsided. I think that's important to note. The book that he liked best of Edith Wharton's, and probably the one we'd put in the Kidskin library, is Ethan Frome. And somebody talked about how you had to read that in high school and it was awful. Who said that? How many people have read Ethan Frome? You know what happens in Ethan Frome. Poor Ethan, pardon? Oh, yes. So what happens in Edith and Frome is that, of course, he is married to an older woman. A younger woman comes into the household. They fall in love, and they decide that they'll go on a sled ride that will sort of end their misery. And, of course, it doesn't end anything. They simply get wounded, and they have to live out the rest of their lives together. And Maddie Silver, once she's wounded, isn't such a hot choice. Yeah. But what's interesting about this novel and makes this novel a modern novel to read, and it's a sense of Roosevelt's maybe maturing of his literary taste, that in the novel, in the introduction to the novel, Edith Wharton says this about it, and this is what makes it a modern novel, actually. It's a story not told from Ethan Frome's point of view, nor Maddie Silver's. Ethan Frome is a man with a rich and deep emotional life, but he's inarticulate. He can't talk about it. We've been talking about Theodore Roosevelt and the ways that he may have harbored or protected himself from the emotional life. Certainly in this literary experience that he's having with one novel after another, he's experiencing emotion, even though maybe, like in Ethan Frome, he's not able to articulate it as well as he might. And Edith Wharton says about Ethan Frome, "They were in truth my granite outcroppings, but half emerged from the soil and scarcely articulate." And so that's the novel that when he reads it, Theodore Roosevelt, he didn't like some of her other stuff, but he particularly liked Ethan Frome. Now, as we've been talking about, his relationship with Edith Wharton, someone was talking about they were close friends. They weren't close friends so much as they were, how to put this, they were born into the same culture. They were born into old New York. And as you are with people in your culture, they knew the codes, they knew the tones, they were simpatico. They didn't see each other often. They wrote fondly to each other and of each other, but they knew the world instinctively, intuitively, from the way that they had shared an upbringing. So that when Edith Wharton was doing her war work in Paris, and as Virginia was telling us, she spent much of her wealth. She built a business for seamstresses who were out of work. She built a lace-making school for Belgian refugee girls who needed to have a way to make money. She built a tuberculin hospital. She did all of that. She and Theodore Roosevelt were hawks. They both believed that America had to enter the war in order for Europe to be saved. Full-throatedly, she agreed with him on that. Here she is, and she's in a circle of soldiers. And you know some of them, don't you? Do you know that? This is Quentin, and that's Archibald. And I think this might be Richard Derby. Isn't Quentin wonderful? Yeah, you wonder what kind of promise was there, right? Anyway, Edith Wharton could write to Theodore Roosevelt in the last days of his life. He died 6 months later, but she knew exactly the right tone, the right image to use. And so she wrote in her letter, "I know how you feel about Quentin. He flew away into the dawn and is gathered up to be a part of the great radiance that is breaking over a world redeemed." That hits every note that Roosevelt would have wanted for his son, and talk about manliness or heroism or what we owe to our society. Now, I could end here on that sentimental note, but I'm going to try one more person. As Theodore Roosevelt was dying, as he lay dying, I don't know if they knew for sure he was going to die. He was going to die of a pulmonary embolism. He's in a room on his own. James Amos has come to minister to him, to be a kind of caretaker for him. And according to his doctor, and this comes from a note in the Harvard Library, his doctor said that at the end, it was in bed, and you know the guy, you know he's going to want to read. So what book is he going to ask for at the end? I should ask that as a question. What would be Roosevelt's final book? How could you imagine? What would he ask for? Well, he asked for a list of cheap or dime novels. He wanted Edith to go to the library and get some out. And some of them were detective stories. There are various kinds of formulaic fiction that he liked. But only one name is on the list. And this is the name. Her name is Laura Jean Libby. Does anybody know this person? Okay, Laura Jean Libby was a highly paid dime novelist. She sold 15 million copies of her books. She made maybe $60,000 a year. She wrote 82 working girl romances, and that's what he was looking for. Now, I'm not sure which book. I'm not even sure these arrived back from the library, so we're imagining here. But let's say that Edith went to the library and she pulled one out. It's quite likely to have been this novel, A Dangerous Flirtation. Okay. I wouldn't have thought A Dangerous Flirtation would be the last book that Theodore Roosevelt would read, but it may well have been. And I just add this, I couldn't possibly tell you all the ins and outs of this story. This is a review on Goodreads. Does anybody go to Goodreads when you read things? And everybody will review these. These are books that are often read even today. And so the Goodread reviewer helps us out. A poor girl mistaken for rich heiress. Secret wedding. Presumably honeymoon sex. Secret wedding was a sham. Identical cousins with the same name. Sexual harassment in the workplace. A heroine who faints all the time and almost dies. And then things go wrong. When things go wrong. Attempted suicide. Brain fever. But there it is, the honeymoon baby delivery. So we get the kid. And what, it could very well be that this was on his at his bedside. And this is what Laura Jean Libby, and he wrote to Laura Jean Libby and she wrote to him. But this is what she writes to her readers as a preface to the book. It seems to me, dear reader, as though we were seated by some happy fireside with clasped hands, and I were telling you the quaint fancies that thronged my brain, in which you forgot the whole world for a few brief moments. Thank you.
Catherine, we are essentially out of time, but
What time is it?
it's just about 3:30. I need to sign books.
Okay.
We have a question here.
Your mic is on.
That's a comment. Any questions? Yes.
He was reading, when he was going out to get the boat thieves, down in the bottom of the scow, wrapped in bear skin, he was reading Anna Karenina. He was fascinated and horrified by Roosevelt. If you read a romance, you have the comfort of the formula and the happy ending and the emotional life. If you pick up Leo Tolstoy, anything can happen. So he got very involved with, Anna Karenina is probably the heroine who most ensnarled him. He was about to get married again. I think he was very sexually needy on that trip. And when he read about Anna Karenina and her passion, he kept writing to his sister. That's all he wanted to write about, was, oh, this woman and her passion. And I don't know whether it's immoral or amoral. Anyway, when you pick up a novel by somebody like when you pick up a novel by somebody by Leo Tolstoy, Tolstoy can do anything to you. So what happens to Anna Karenina when she can't make life work is she puts her head on the rail and the train decapitates her. It was that kind of reading.
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler. It was that kind of. It was
It's 1,100 pages.
It was that.
Now you wrecked it.
I'm sorry. Maybe that didn't happen. Maybe somebody
She works
saves
it
her
out. She works it out.
and she gets married at the end.
Wow.
At any rate, yes, that's a true story.
Yeah, great.
Anybody else?
And then they ran out, so he asked redheaded Mike Finnegan, do you have any other books? And Finnegan had a dime novel of Jesse James. And Roosevelt said, let me have it. I'll get it back to you after your prison term.
I think all those books on the list were books that Roosevelt had already read.
Yes, here.
Yes. That's right. Yeah.
Early writing, sometimes some classics that should be finished, but should be better known and aren't. And at any rate, if you can find in the publishing history of any sort of book that says Veritable Press did it, that's your ticket to any sort.
Thank you.
Veritable Press.
Thank you. Many of these books have been, in fact, they're available online. Many of them are digitized, and more things every day are being digitized.
Last chance. Anyone here? Yes? Why didn't he like Mark Twain, and vice versa?
Oh, my goodness. Mark Twain was angry with Roosevelt's politics. He was especially upset. There was a massacre in the Morro Crater in the Philippines, and he, along with other anti-imperialists, were very much opposed to Roosevelt's policy. But whenever they met, by the way, they were civil to each other. And when, I'll tell just one brief thing, when Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to the White House, that was the first writer he invited. Later at Yale, he said to Twain, I don't know, there's such a mess about this, because everybody was angry. And he said to Twain, what advice would you give me? And Twain said to him, if you invite Booker T. Washington to your own house, it's your own business, but when you invite him to the people's house, you'd better observe the color line. I was surprised with Twain for that, but there were these things back and forth between the two.
So thank you.
They're in the Pigskin Library.
Twain was in the Pigskin Library.
Yes, indeed, the two novels.
Katherine, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.